Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chandy, for inviting me to join you today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the NISO Standardized Tag Suite, STS, and more importantly, what it is about STS and the value of STS that it could bring to publishing standards. Before I do, very quickly, can I get a quick show of hands of people familiar with NISO? Okay, about half. That's a good number. So, apologies in advance for those who know NISO. I'm going to inform those who don't what we are. We are an ANSI accredited SDO. We work in the space of information and documentation. We have about 230-ish institutional members, and that splits between the publishing community, the library community, and the software providers that work as intermediaries between those groups. We have probably 500 or so volunteers working on various projects. I think we've got about 30 or 35 different standards initiatives. We are responsible for a variety of standards that I'm sure you're familiar with: ISSN numbers, ISBN numbers, MARC records, DOIs. We don't manage those things, we don't distribute ISBN numbers, but we create those standards. We also represent US interests to ISO. Next week we'll be headed off to a TC46 meeting. So there's 5 subcommittees. TC46, for those of you who don't follow all of the numbering systems in ISO, that's information and documentation. We serve as the secretariat for TC46 SC9, that is identification and description. So ISBN, ISSN, ISAN, all of the identifiers that work in the cultural space. We also represent US interests to JTC1 SC34, which is the group that does document description and processing languages. So think Microsoft Office. So that's the kind of standard space that we operate in. Now, as developers of standards, we don't think twice about the value of standards when it comes to manufacturing or automobiles, airplanes, water systems, plumbing, etc. Because in manufacturing, you wouldn't want to have to build one of these every time you want to produce something. You want to trust the standards in electricity, etc. It's critical for manufacturing. But we don't often think about the standards that are related to the publishing systems that we all work with. And yet many of them exist. They weren't developed necessarily through ANSI accredited standards development processes, but they have existed for centuries, actually, in many cases. For example, actually many of the standards in our space have become so familiar, they're part of our lexicon. Uppercase and lowercase started as a standard for where did you put the letters in a typesetting arrangement. The capital letters go up here and the lower letters go down here. That's why you get uppercase and lowercase. Page numbers were developed so that people who were folding signatures knew in which order they should go, because most of the people in the 15th century were illiterate. They also didn't understand, because Johann over here might be producing papers faster than Jakob over here, and how do you put them back together? You put numbers on them so you can put them in order. Even our language has become standardized. There's a really interesting paper Ben Franklin wrote in the 18th century about a scheme for a new alphabet and a new way in which we could reform spelling, because color is spelled like that, not like that. And he had an interesting system of glyphs to deal with some of the vagaries of the English language. And I can say glyphs in this meeting probably because this is a group that understands what those things are. But you can use different glyphs, and Franklin had developed some. It never took off, but it was an idea about standardizing our language. So we've moved into an environment where digital publishing, content distribution, is taking place electronically, digitally, mostly on the web. So how do we create standards for that digital environment, because we've gone a long way from this 15th century manuscript, which exists in the Walters Art Museum up the road, to these sort of digital representations of information. And as we've made that transition, many of you are probably familiar with the term skeuomorph, which is we take the new technology and replicate the old technology and make it look like the old technology so that people are comfortable using it. Essentially, PDF is a skeuomorph of a printed page. It doesn't take advantage of all of the possibilities that are available in distributing digital technology. What makes a document a digitally native document? It is certainly much more than this, taking a PDF and, ooh, wow, we can put it on a phone, right? Truly digital native documents require a vast number of additional attributes that are critically important to functioning in a digital environment. You need good quality metadata, for example, because no one walks through the stacks in a digital library. There is no, this book is next to this book in a digital environment. The only thing people see is metadata. The only thing they discover is metadata. And if you're not investing in good quality metadata, your content, whatever that content is, won't be discoverable. It needs to be interoperable between reading platforms, discovery platforms, authentication systems, ideally in standard formats so that it can be interchanged. Accessibility is a critical feature so that people like me whose eyesight isn't what it used to be can read. Multimedia is an increasingly important element of content. Is it adaptive to the reading device? All of these elements are core to what it means to be a digitally native document. And no offense to my friends in the PDF world, and I'm sure they might argue with me in this case, but PDF isn't really those things. So how does this apply to the world of standards? And I'm going to do a little vertigo inducement here. So imagine you are an engineer and you're working at the top of this 1,500-foot tower, right? And you need the manual for how this radio tower works. You don't want to have to climb back down the 1,500-foot tower. And he's pulling out his cell phone, right, to look up maybe your standard. If that's a PDF, you don't want to be scrolling through the PDF to find page 217, right? You want to find the information that you need when you need it. And we should be creating standards in an environment where he or she has the information that they need when they need it. So I talked about this back in 2010. I was invited to speak at the Standards Engineering Society meeting in 2010. I talked about these things in terms of digital documents and the trends in electronic publishing, why this community needs to start moving in the direction of digitally accessible, digitally native documents. They need consistent reference, they need linking, possibly a common DTD, interleaking. What are the users demanding? What do they need? And how can we fulfill that? So, question to you all, we're now nearly 10 years in. Have we made progress? And I'd like to think yes. And I'm going to use ISO here as an example of some of the things that can be done with a digitally native production infrastructure. So this is a search on the ISO online browsing platform. They have a standard for T, and this was really interesting. There was an argument between the English and the Irish in the development of the national standard for T. in terms of when do you put the milk in? Do you put the milk in first, or do you put the tea in first and add the milk? So this is, gotta love standards conversations. So search the ISO browsing platform for tea, right? This is fairly standard. I think most of you, if you have an electronic publishing platform or discovery platform, this is simple, right? You index the service. So someone goes in, searches for tea, milk. Here are the relevant standards. The one that was the center of the argument, 3720, is the second one down. So what ISO has done is presented users with some of the text of the standard. ISO makes its money selling standards, so they don't want to give the entire thing away for free. But they have found that users want to know, at least at a high level, what's this document about? So they provide freely the introduction, the scope, the normative references, and the terms and definitions of that standard. Importantly, and this kind of gets into the value of digitally native documents, all of the references are linked and active. And so you can go from document to document to document. Now, this is useful in the context of ISO. Wouldn't it be more useful if we as a community had an interlinking system of all standards? Because ISO standards don't just reference ISO standards, they reference IEEE standards or NISO standards or whomever is responsible for T standards. So that's one thing that they work on. And this is where life gets really interesting. You get down to the bottom past the definitions, and then in support of ISO's business model, oh wait, only the informative information is available. If you want the text of the actual standard, you have to buy that. Now, that is an interesting business opportunity, which is possible because you can segment what part of the documents you make freely available versus what parts of the document you retain behind a paywall. So this is something, part of the functionality of having a digitally native document, which you can expose elements of, not the entire thing. You couldn't do this in a PDF environment where, hey, you only get access to pages 3 to 5. You get the file or you don't get the file. In an environment where you can get sections of the file, you can create a business opportunity for your customers that drives usage, or at least drives interest. Here's enough information for you to understand what we're doing, what we're talking about, and where do you move forward from there. So realistically, how do we do this? How many of you have an organizational workflow that is this? Team writes a document in Microsoft Word or Google Docs, and oh, we hit the print button, generate a PDF. Nobody. We do. I see a few quiet hands going, well, kind of. This is this is sort of a traditional publishing workflow. I guess if you wouldn't be here at a Typefi Users Conference if you weren't having a more productive workflow. Because we need to get to a point where instead of generating PDF from Word, you go from generating a Word to an XML output that you can then transform to things like PDF or HTML or an online browsing platform, or send it to a third-party distributor that they can then integrate into their systems. And what we've done is try to create a system where STS allows you to avoid developing one of these on your own. Because developing a DTD from scratch, from the beginning, is a fairly expensive process. About 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, it would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000 to $500,000 to create a DTD on your own. It would probably take 3-4 years of your staff time to develop that, understand your workflow, understand your processes, etc. How do you build that system together? that was a huge barrier for people moving into this direction. Fortunately, we've moved into a space where, and this was kind of supported first by this notion, and this is one of my favorite quotes, I'm sure you've all heard it, with regard to standards, that standards are like toothbrushes and everyone has one, but no one would want to use someone else's. I think it was Connie Morella. And this applies to production workflows as well. I don't want to use someone else's DTD because IEEE's production workflow is totally different from mine. The elements of ASME standards are totally different from NISO standards, right? How could we possibly use the same DTD? How could we possibly use the same production languages? So even within our small segment of the publishing community, this notion actually rings true in terms of what kind of problems are we running into. Which then gets me to now talking a little bit more detail about the STS project. So STS is developed as part of the suite of standards that developed out of the National Library of Medicine, which eventually became the NLM DTD. That DTD then became the JATS standard, the Journal Article Tag Suite standard. And there are a variety of flavors of or derivatives of that standard. STS is one, there's BITS for books, and then also STS for standards. STS originally started out in ISO as a way in which ISO wanted to get a handle on its own production workflow. They had goals to improve the publication process, make that process more efficient, output to multiple structures, PDF, HTML, PDF. They had a vision for creating the online browsing platform. There's a paper that describes the ISO goals and processes written by Bruce Rosenblum from Anera. And they reviewed in this process a variety of XML structures, DITA, DocBook, JATS, TEI, for an approach for moving forward with this project. And in 2011, they developed the STS standard, which was a derivative of JATS, but it included a variety of elements that journal articles don't have, things like normative references. Wherever possible, they were interested in aligning the STS standard with JATS, and their goal was to make those changes to that structure as minimal as possible. And they announced this at the 39th SPAB, I think that was in 2011, 2012. And they posted, not only they moved in the direction of outputting their content into STS form, they also posted all of the documentation that went along with it. The DTD, the documentation, other resources. And they said, here it is, it's available, you can do what you want with it. Other organizations were interested in this. They caught their eye, like, oh, well, maybe we could build on the work that ISO had done. ISO recognized at that time that what they had developed was specific for them. It wasn't generalizable. There are other things that national member bodies do with regard to adoptions. There are different structures that might be specific to other standards development. So we started a conversation, we, NISO, and other members of the standards community started a conversation about how could we expand participation and the appropriateness and the translatability of the STS standard to other organizations. There's also a concern by other SDOs and other national member bodies that, and I'm sure all of you as people involved in other standards development organizations can appreciate, you don't want one party who is vested interest in development of a particular standard to govern that process, right? You'd like that process to be done through a neutral third party. NISO, as a standards development organization that brings together, we have a variety of SDOs that participate in NISO. We were a natural third party for this. So what are some of the structures that differ between JATS and STS. First of all, let's talk about the similarities. There are similarities between journal articles, right, and standards. Journal articles have sections, they have tables, they have figures, they have equations, deep math, etc. They have bibliographies. So first thing, we looked at the similarities of the two. There are differences, as I mentioned, normative references, etc. But JATS has been, or at least derivatives of JATS, have been in production in the publishing space for well over a decade. So it's well tested. Many of the standards developers, SDOs, have journals publishing programs that were already using JATS. So production departments were already familiar with it. And JATS has also got strong third-party support from organizations like Typefi, like NERA. Third-party preservation systems are familiar with JATS. It's part of the Library of Congress recommendation for long-term preservation. It's deeply embedded in this space. So NISO pulled together a rather large group of SDOs to work on the development of STS. This is the steering committee of the development project. Things have moved on since then, but you can see we've got large SDOs, IEEE, ASME, national standards development bodies like BSI and DIN. We had participation from ANSI, also smaller organizations. We had systems developers like Mulberry and NERA. We had some library involvement. We had some corporate distributor involvement as well. We also had a technical committee. So these were the deeply technical people who, and this is not pejorative, like to speak in angle brackets, who actually got in deeply into the code, deeply into the tags, deeply did most of the technical work. We were very open and transparent. We posted the meeting minutes from every meeting publicly, which is something that not every standards organization does, in order to build trust both amongst the people who were working on the project, but also people who were outside of the project. We actually got more interest from the community in participating than we could realistically have on a working group in order to get things done. So that was part of the rationale for sharing this information. And then in 2017, we published the standard. There is a PDF version, which is completely useless. There are non-normative versions in a variety of usable structures. Then it moved into a process of maintenance. We have moved STS as well as JATS into a process of continuous maintenance. So there is a standing committee led by Bruce Rosenbroom and Robert Wheeler at ASME on continually reviewing feedback from the community and improving the standard. So, from your perspective, why should we move to using STS? You have, obviously, the benefits of an XML workflow, so you have easier production of things like HTML, PDF, mobile versions. You can create new products based on your STS-based XML, such as the ISO online browsing platform. Many of the SDOs use third-party distributors. Those third-party distributors are making really innovative products where content is aggregated from multiple resources. This makes their process a lot easier and hopefully less expensive, thereby, hopefully, fingers crossed, increasing your royalty returns. There's an opportunity to co-publish standards if everyone's using the same DTD. So we could create a consortium of SDOs interested in distributing, and thereby sidestep some of the third-party distributors if we as a market so chose. You also have easier integration and easier exchange with partners. If everyone is using the same model, You don't have to worry about, well, we have this output format for this particular service provider, this output for this particular service provider. Those interchanges require costs and continuous maintenance because eventually someone will upgrade their system and the systems will break. And that process is difficult whenever it happens. We'll also be able to create an environment of inter-standards linking, which is something that most users in the situations that I've been talking with users about in the context of IHS meetings or Thomson Reuters meetings, hear feedback from users that they'd like to move seamlessly from one system to another, one standard to another. As I mentioned, metadata is critically important. It's critically important for search, for discovery. Known search is difficult without good metadata. You also will see benefits in site crawling and indexing as systems become familiar with the languages and understanding the tagging structure across a variety of publishers that are exposing information in STS. You'll see better discovery. And ideally, where we will see the best return is in the creation of standardized tools that support standards development publication and processes. So in that aspect, it's easier for Typefi, for example, to develop one system based on a standard that publishers adopt, rather than having to tweak or reconfigure their system to address the vagaries and expectations that each of us has because we all want our special snowflake, our own toothbrush. That ideally will lead to reduced costs for production systems and distribution systems. In part because we had such great involvement in the development of STS, we're also seeing moving in the direction of great adoption of STS. This is sort of an alphabet soup of SDOs. The organizations marked as 1 are organizations that have currently adopted and are either in production or creating and distributing their standards using the STS standard. So obviously ISO, but organizations like BSI, DIN, the American Petroleum Institute, NEN in the Netherlands, IEEE, which is a variant, SAE. Those are all organizations that currently have STS in production. You have a number of organizations that are in the process of adopting STS. So it's not quite in production, but they're working on it. So ASTM, ASME, CSA in Canada, NIST, the Department of Defense, large entities in the standard space moving in the direction of STS. And then you have a variety of other organizations like NISO that are moving in the direction of STS. If you're anywhere on this spectrum and you aren't on the list and you'd like to be, let Bruce, me, or Robert know and we'll get your names added. So as I mentioned, this is part of this tag suite family that is a derivative of the original NLM DTD. And to give you a sense of where we've come and how far back this process goes, so we released version 1.2 of JATS just in February. NISO also launched a project on developing a standard-specific ontology, totally separate from the world of XML, but that project was launched in January of 1999. The STS standard, oddly, where's STS? Did I not put STS on this list? I didn't. There's a books version, as I mentioned, that came out in 2016. The first version of JATS came out in 2012. And the original NLM came out back in 2003. So as you can see, we were like 16 plus years in production of derivatives of this project. So to summarize, what we as a community have done since 2013, we took an original $150,000 investment that NLM, with support from the Mellon Foundation, did to create the original NLM DTD. We added the work of more than 100 XML experts and volunteers over the space of the last 16 years. We took 15 years of time, effort, and energy from those 100+ people. We added tens of thousands of dollars more from organizations that contributed to the development of STS. So many thanks to, I think, ASME, ASTM, Mulberry, and ISO, at least. Possibly a few more. Apologies if I've forgotten. And then focused all of this attention on the standards community, on the standards development workflow, so that you don't have to build one of these at a cost of several $100,000 and several years of FTE man time, person time, to develop one of these for your production workflow. So now that we've done all of this, put all of this investment in, the question for you all, if you haven't yet adopted STS, is what could you do with this infrastructure? What could you do with the cost savings? What could you do to move your business forward now that this is available and also free to use? Thank you.